Howdy mates, here's a second video log for today. So I decided to just make a second video so that my first video wouldn't be as time consuming to watch. So kind of breaking it up, as it were, into smaller pieces. But as I was saying in my last video, I want to discuss more upon what really makes up an estuary. You know, like what you can find, and why it's important both economically and environmentally. But first, I want to start with environmentally. So here we go. So, alright. So, as I described in my last video, estuaries are essentially described as a nursery habitat. Now, you might be wondering, what does a nursery really mean? Well, think of it this way. A nursery could be used as an analogy with, say, a living community, right? Whether it be like a community center, a retirement home, or even maybe like an Eagles club. I mean, just a couple of examples to use, right? So those are like common gathering places where people come together and live, or just meet up. Well, in a similar sense, an estuarine habitat kind of acts in the same way. It's essentially like one big resort for our wildlife. But here's a kicker, though. So, for instance, a lot of fish that we like down here, and just to name a couple, they can include snook or even tarpon, and in other parts of the world, even salmon. But what's fascinating about these fish is later in life, you'll often find them in the ocean. However, though, here's the thing. They don't spend their entire life in the ocean. Typically, most of these fishes that I speak of won't go into the ocean until they reach closer into their adulthood. So, what's fascinating is these fish that I speak of, they'll oftentimes spend their early life here for, just having a home to stay protected from other predators and just to start off of an easy life. Just get adjusted to being a fish, right? Getting used to that mentality. Now, with that being said, most of these adult fish, whether it be snook or tarpon, they'll actually return from the ocean to they'll go back to where they were born, as a matter of fact, and they'll spawn to produce their eggs. And that's what's quite remarkable, is these fish actually remember the exact spot where they were born. And thus they will reproduce the next generation at that same spot. And the process repeats itself over and over. And so that's one way in how estuaries can really act as a nursery. Now, estuaries are also well known for hosting several separate types of wading birds, whether it be cattle egrets, great white egrets, osprey. There's actually one up on that dead tree up there, or even double-breasted cormorants, or even, trying to think of any other examples, or just a white egret too, or even great blue herons. I mean, there's so many different species of birds that oftentimes they'll use this as sort of like a relaxing spot for either just hunting or just to rest, as I just mentioned, and even breed as well. And oftentimes, these breeding spots are called rookeries. But these are even useful for migratory birds as well. So oftentimes, you know, for migratory birds, they travel quite a long distance. You know, usually a couple of 1,000 miles one way. And oftentimes, you know, birds, they get tired just as we do. After using a lot of energy, they need a rest stop. So in a sense, these act as a rest stop. Think of it as the migratory birds use the sky as their highway. And then the estuaries are essentially those rest stops along the highway. You know, to relax, eat food, and even reproduce if they wanted, which they usually do. But that is, I've always enjoyed using that analogy when describing estuaries. But then, yeah, so they just have an essential wildlife value. And with that being said, too, another important environmental contribution that estuaries provide is they host mangroves, right? So like, for instance, right in front of me, we got an example of a buttonwood that is indeed, it's often considered to be another type of mangrove. Mangroves mostly describe trees that sprawl out most of the time. And these mangroves, they essentially act as, say, like a bodyguard to an estuary, you know, or to the mainland. Yeah, they act as those tough bodyguards. Because were it not for mangroves, essentially the brunt force of the ocean would make its way to the mainland and even the estuary even easier, thus causing habitat destruction and even further erosion of a given landscape. So mangroves are by far one of the most important type of trees that you can find in the world. Not only that, but estuaries which have mangroves are also described to be one of the most productive ecosystems in the world. So, you may be wondering, like, how is that so? Well, a lot of it has to do with our climate, essentially, right? So, like, what do most trees do? You know, as we've been taught during grade school, trees always, they act as basically an air filter for our planet. So what most mangroves and other trees do, they'll take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then in the process of photosynthesis, they'll actually produce oxygen as a result, in which that is the most important form of air that all of us need to survive. Because without oxygen, we would not survive on this planet. And what's truly remarkable about mangroves in general is they sequester, or they take in, you know, up to 6 times more carbon each year than that of a rainforest, or like even the Amazon rainforest, right? So I actually read something that mangroves can literally sequester like quite a few hundred tons of carbon each year. And that's just one mangrove individually. Never mind a whole ecosystem provided for them. So, with that being said, for all of us, that may bring up the topic of climate change. Now, here's something that I want to clear up for you guys. Oftentimes, a lot of people, not mentioning anyone in particular, I have noticed that some people believe global warming and climate change are the same, when in fact, they're not the same at all. And here's why. Global warming describes only one aspect. It basically only describes a rise in the global temperature of the planet. You know, like a rise in the temperature, essentially. But that's all it describes. But climate change, on the other hand, describes more than just the increase in temperature. It also describes the consequences of those types of changes. So like melting ice, or habitat destruction, and even the change in the climate itself. Because climate refers to weather over time. But then weather only describes the conditions within one day. Climate describes weather over time. But that's the thing, like, carbon dioxide essentially acts as something called a greenhouse gas. That means, think of a greenhouse, right? Greenhouse is supposed to trap in heat so that it can maintain the livelihood of other plants that are within the greenhouse. But the carbon dioxide, if there's too much of it, it acts very similar to that. Basically, carbon dioxide will trap the heat on the planet, and thus it really causes that rise in the temperatures. And as a result, with those rise in temperatures, that's where you'll start to see the melting ice and rising sea levels, just as a couple of examples, of course. But that's just something to keep in mind, though. Global warming and climate change are by no means the same thing. But with that being said, these mangroves that I was describing can actually act as like a combatant against climate change, since they sequester so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It will create oxygen in turn. Unfortunately, a lot of these ecosystems throughout the world are actually being threatened due to human development. That's like the largest factor. So, with more human development, the more environmental destruction there is. So essentially, you're taking down that bodyguard. And then when that bodyguard is no longer there, that form of protection is diminished. And thus it really increases that risk of climate change happening. It increases the probability, you could say. But that's why I think oftentimes estuaries don't really deserve, or they don't really get the credit that they deserve, especially since they host the mangroves. And much of our wildlife depend on them, too. So, just keep this in mind, you guys. You know, this is part of what I do as part of my page. I always want to spread the knowledge, because if you don't spread the knowledge, then what's the use? You know? That's where people wind up making more decisions that may not be the best for them. And that's why education is so important. It really gives us an understanding of what is really happening. That's why it's with my duty to spread that knowledge. So, really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and forgive me for the length, but with this subject, there's a lot to say. And it's just something that I think shouldn't go unnoticed. So if you guys really want to share this video, you guys are more than welcome to. I mean, that's the other point of my page too. Like, you guys are totally welcome to share my content if you so wish. And yeah, just keep that in mind, you guys. And I really hope that you enjoyed this video too and taking the time. Thank you. And also, to finish off too, I'm currently running like a fundraiser to basically have an honorary reef installed. Now, this honorary reef is in dedication to my great aunt, Susan Curtis, who passed away about 3 years ago because of breast cancer. And so, as a commemoration for my great aunt, I want to help raise enough money to put in a mini reef install, which essentially helps filter our waters in this area, or any part of the world. So, just check out that part on my page when you can. I shared like a whole post regarding it. And if you guys are willing to help and support, that would be awesome. So, thank you guys for taking the time and for your support. And once again, Journey on a Journey is outwards. Take care, folks. See ya.